our speaker today, Ethlie and Vare. She has a great blend of brain science and humor to make the topic of love addiction really come alive. So I think you're going to learn a lot and enjoy. So thank you for gifting us with your presentation today.
Thank you,
Yeah.
and thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. So take it away.
Take
Ethlie.
it away, okay.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you all for coming. Oh, what an intimidating and knowledgeable house. I will try to keep up the standards here. And I have to tell you about the hat. I feel a little foolish standing here right now because I actually have a swollen face and 2 black eyes. Hence the hat. It's to distract your attention. It's, you know, it's just a coincidence. Minor surgical procedure, a little bit of swelling, but I have now become the butt of my own joke about love addiction, which is what do you say to a woman with 2 black eyes? What can you say? You already tried to tell her twice. Now, any of you who are counselors would, of course, actually say, run! Get out of that relationship before he kills you. But it's rather like telling a cigarette smoker, you have to stop doing that. It's really bad for you. The cigarette smoker knows it's bad for her. It doesn't mean it's easy for her to give up that bad habit. Same thing with the love addict. It's like, I know he's bad for me. I can't live without him. Addiction is addiction, and I don't care if it's the Marlboro or the Marlboro man. Addiction. Current recognized definition of addiction: a chronic and relapsing brain disease characterized by dependence on a mind-altering substance despite negative life consequences. I always change it to say mind-altering substance or behavior despite negative life consequences, because a mind-altering substance can be exogenous, taken in from the outside, your alcohol, your heroin, your cocaine, or endogenous, produced from within, basically neurotransmitters, specifically dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, adrenaline, testosterone, oxytocin, vasopressin. We will talk about some of these interesting things. And what I say is that sex and love addicts have a pathological relationship to our own body chemistry. So that's what I'm here to talk about. I always say that one of the easiest ways to spot an addiction is to stop doing it and see what happens. See, have you ever felt this way? You're curled up on the couch in a fetal position, waiting for him to call. Nothing else in the world matters, nothing. The void inside you is so big you could crawl inside it. You have no appetite, but it doesn't matter because you can't taste anything anyway except maybe sugar and salt. You relive past conversations in your head, revising and rewording them over and over. You weep at random intervals. You can't fall asleep. When you finally do fall asleep, you can't stay asleep. Then you can't get out of bed. When you do finally get up, you reread some old emails or listen to some old voicemails. It's calming a little to hear that voice. You write an email you will never send, or even worse, will. Revising and rewording it over and over. You weep at random intervals. The phone rings and you leap for it like it's a pot boiling over on the stove. The anticipation makes your whole body quiver. If it is him, the euphoria feels like pink champagne tickling your nose. Your voice goes up a register. If it isn't him, the disappointment weighs like lead. You go back to the couch. You weep at random intervals. If you do go out, which happens less and less often, your heart lurches into your throat every time you see a car, the same make and model as his car, or a similar make and model, or the same color. You imagine he's about to walk out of every doorway, about to turn every corner. You look at every girl on the sidewalk and imagine that he's going out with her. You weep at random intervals. You may be familiar with some of that behavior. You may have even experienced some of those feelings. The symptoms of a broken heart: intense craving, muscle aches and pains, nausea and vomiting, cramping in the limbs, feeling of heaviness in the body, crying jags, insomnia. Oh no, wait, those are the withdrawal symptoms from heroin. So the big caveat before we start all of this is I'm going to talk about the science as we know it today. If I were giving this talk 100 years ago, I would be talking about the different bumps in your cranium and how they can determine your personality, and we would have all been absolutely convinced that that was the latest scientific information, and we're changing all the time. So I'm going to tell you where we are today. So here's where we are today. Gets complicated. I am amazed that I have trouble convincing professionals that love addiction is a genuine addiction, as much of an addiction as drugs or alcohol can be. A professor at the neurosurgery department at the University of Texas has a great quote. He says, "The human brain is programmed to incentivize behaviors that contribute to survival. The mesolimbic dopaminergic system, the reward center, or the lizard brain, rewards eating and sexuality with powerful pleasure incentives. Cocaine, opioids, alcohol, and other drugs subvert or hijack these pleasure systems and cause the brain to think a drug high is necessary to survive. Evidence is now strong that natural rewards such as food and sex affect the reward system in the same way drugs affect them." I'm amazed that it's been easy to convince the world that drugs and alcohol can hijack the reward system, but not convince them that food and sex, which really are, survival mechanisms, are harder. So we finally started accepting the premise of process or behavioral addiction when we started looking at actual addict brains actually being affected by the behavior. 2002 fMRI study, and this is when we started really working on this, was in the early 2000s. We have a study showing that the caudate nucleus is activated by looking at photos of the beloved in exactly the same way as it's activated by injecting heroin or cocaine. Same areas of the brain light up. A 2007 German study showed that viewing pornography and snorting cocaine resulted in the exact same activity in the superior frontal region. A 2010 study found the same forebrain activity when losing money as being romantically rejected. So food, sex, money, love, to the lizard brain, it all reads as survival. So another quote to read you. "The compulsion to call was completely beyond my control. I couldn't stop myself. I would hold off for short intervals, but always there would come the tide of overpowering intensity. I was engulfed in it. I felt such a sense of panic that I really believed I would die if I didn't pick up the phone." That's actually me cheating. That's a paragraph from the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's a woman talking about reaching for a drink. But the feelings of reaching for the drink and reaching for the phone, of craving that voice, are exactly the same. Now, here's where it gets trickier. Oh, here's I think I wanted it. Yeah, I actually wanted those in the opposite order. Here's your cocaine brain and your orgasm brain, but there's more than one kind of love. And the latest data now suggests that different areas of the brain are stimulated differently by different emotional responses, and nature intended it that way. Anthropologist Dr. Helen Fisher, who has done seminal work in this area of brain scans, even though her sample size was pretty small and it was pretty homogeneous, but still groundbreaking work. Her line is, "I think romantic love is one of 3 different brain systems that evolved for reproduction. The sex drive urges us to seek a range of partners. Romantic love motivates us to focus our mating energy on just one individual at a time, and feelings of attachment enable us to remain with this person at least long enough to raise a child through infancy." So it is nature, it's natural, it's reasonable, unless it becomes distorted, unless the amygdala is holding sway over the prefrontal cortex, unless the lizard brain is stimulated more than the executive or decision-making part of the brain. So then suddenly you have sexual pursuit of anything that moves, you have attachment way past the point of 2 black eyes, and you have a romantic obsession involving a fresh soulmate of the month every 4th Tuesday. So what I have learned about sex and love addiction when I was doing this work is that it's not a 2-pronged disease. It's not the love addict and the love avoidant, as a lot of people try to turn it into a binary. My opinion is that just like Helen Fisher's anthropological studies, we're dealing with 3 different aspects of addiction, and they're all affected by different neural pathways. So in my mind, we have the infatuation addict, we have the relationship junkie, we have the sexaholic. Or as I say in a wonderfully alliterative way, you can call it love, lust, and limerence, or you can call it attraction, affection, and attachment. So all are stimulated by different balances of different hormones, brain, neurotransmitters. Now, we don't know that much about our neurotransmitters. Are you trying to come in? Would you like to come in and sit? There are 2 chairs in front, and I needed a drink of water anyway. That's all right. It starts getting really sciencey now, so it's good to pause every once in a while. So, we're familiar with 90-something neurotransmitters at the moment. There are probably 500. We don't know. We're just beginning to scratch the surface here. But one thing that we have figured out is that the monoamines are really important in sex and love addiction, particularly dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. Now, dopamine regulates reward-driven learning, okay? Desire, focus, craving, anticipation. Dopamine is also linked to creativity, which is why there's so much art about love. Cocaine increases dopamine production tenfold, which is why there's so much bad art about love. Then you've got serotonin, which is your that sweet exhale of satisfaction. A professor at the University of Pisa studied 20 newly in love couples, self-identified, and found that their serotonin levels were comparable to that of obsessive compulsive disorder patients. It's true. There's a relationship,
I'm sorry, newly in love?
Newly in love. So this is the hyperfocus. This is lack of serotonin creates an increase in hyperfocus and obsessive thinking. And autistic and Asperger's patients also demonstrate a similar hyperfocus to the romantic obsession of the newly infatuated, which is also connected to serotonin. So you can see that this is closely related to ADHD, it's closely related to OCD, it's even part of the spectrum. So it's a big brain issue, and the more we find out about it, the bigger we realize it is. Oxytocin, or in males a little more influence of vasopressin, has to do with bonding and fidelity. It's that staying with the partner until you raise the children thing. Oxytocin, we all know, is released when you nurse a baby, also during orgasm. Oxytocin supplements help decrease repetitive compulsive behavior in Asperger's and OCD patients, according to a 2003 study. So there's it isn't that there's anything wrong with any of these hormones. The question is that their balance gets skewed, and when their balance gets skewed, it changes the basic behavior pattern or even the personality of the person that you're dealing with. Like, for instance, you're going to a tropical resort. Do you want to learn to jet ski? Do you want to chill out at the spa? Do you want to hang at the pool? Each of those is propelled by a different collection of neurotransmitter balances. Me, I am a dopamine baby. I am an infatuation addict. I love me some dopamine. Dopamine is associated with anticipatory desire and motivation, commonly referred to as wanting, or in the love addict community, pining. As opposed to the pleasure of actual consumption, which is more opioid associated, right? I'm the perfect example of the how can I love you if you won't go away philosophy of relationship. It's loving to me reads like pining. Loving to me reads like reaching for something that's just out of attainment, which is why love addicts will pursue the unavailable, because it's that motivation and desire which is the reward more so than the actual existence of the bonding. So you'd think the more dopamine I got, the happier I would be. Tricky problem, too much dopamine causes psychosis and is connected to schizophrenia. So, you know. Now, here's a great study I found. You can wipe out the dopamine-producing cells in rats with a neurotoxin. And what you find out is the rats have so little desire or interest in eating that they will actually starve to death. However, if you feed them, they're every bit as satisfied as any other rat. That's the difference between the dopamine and the opioid receptors. Food is still satisfying, they just have no desire to pursue that satisfaction. So these are very different neural tracks. Now, the reason I love dopamine is because my brain doesn't recognize the dopamine that's already in it. I have inefficient D2 receptors, and there is a massive amount of supportive research now to show that that is absolutely genetic, that I have a genetic flaw in my A1 allele, which gives me inefficient D2 receptors.
Wow.
Reduced dopamine concentration in the prefrontal cortex, also associated with ADHD, which anyone who knows me will know that I have a very short attention span. I remember telling my adult son once, he says, so Russell, I've been diagnosed with ADD. And he says, duh! Anyone who's ever sat next to you on a couch for 5 minutes could have told you that. You didn't have to go to a therapist. So here's the horrible problem with having inefficient D2 receptors. The very thing you do to make up for it messes them up even worse, okay? Cocaine and amphetamine increase dopamine production. So at Wake Forest, they did PET scans of rhesus monkeys given cocaine and amphetamine, and what they showed is that the D2 receptor availability decreased by 20% within a week.
Oh, wow.
Right? So it's kind of like, oh yeah, this is too complicated for me. It's kind of like I started out with pleasure centers that were a little deaf, so I kept turning up the volume on the pleasure, and the louder I yell, the deafer they get. And it becomes an absolute descending spiral, which is what contributes in substance abuse to the phenomenon of tolerance. In love addiction, just I think contributes to even more pain. Because you can't really fall in love more. You can do it more often. Korea University did a study of internet addiction, not porn, just internet period, and also found reduced D2 receptors there. They also found that feeding rats cheesecake and sausage decreases the number of D2 receptors in a similar way to feeding them cocaine and heroin. And in fact, within 40 days, the rats' D2 receptors were numb to the point that they required higher levels of fats and sugar to achieve the same level of satisfaction. So I feel bad for all those rats.
Sorry, if we want to learn more specifically on this specific subject you're talking about, which,
okay.
Can you just tell me like what,
yes.
where to read more on that? The D2 deficiency and with which research is for that?
Okay, I don't have that much more research here in my little
can you just
folder.
Read what those
sure.
studies were then? So I can
absolutely.
down?
And yeah, and this is
Are
very.
They down on this list?
They, some of them may be, and all of it's very Googleable, because the research increases all the time. Okay, I will go back to.
Sorry, I just.
No, that's no problem. So this is the actual. Here is your neurotransmitter system in the brain, and basically, you all did all of your brain studies about ganglia and gaps and all that. So I'm not a brain scientist. It's been too long since I studied that. But what they know is that the addict brain has a decrease in D2 receptor availability. The D2 receptor is the receptor that processes dopamine. presumably it's one of the receptors that process dopamine because it's D2 as opposed to simply D. So I should think that there's a 1, 3, and 4. But the D2 receptor receives the dopamine. And the problem with the addict brain isn't the lack of availability of dopamine. It's the lack of the ability to transmit the dopamine throughout the neural pathways. And this leads to a phenomenon I'll talk about later, a behavioral phenomenon, which I call the neural cow path, because the normal pathways, because the D2 receptors, and that is connected with the A1 allele, a genetic flaw, which is inheritable, and which can be tested for. So in fact, you could spot an addict or a potential addict with, a DNA test.
I think that allele study was done with alcoholics originally, severe chronic alcoholics, and
Yes.
they found a deficiency in this gene.
And they have found it in behavioral and process addictions too. It's been found in gambling. So it's, yes, this all started with alcoholism, and my contention, what I'm trying to, persuade people out here today is that process addictions, behavioral addictions, particularly really basic ones like sex and love, not only act like alcoholism and drug addiction, but they were first. That my anecdotal experience is that a lot of active alcoholics and drug addicts were using the drugs and alcohol to try and relieve the existential pain of their love addiction, and ended up cutting new neural pathways, connecting that pleasure to the basal ganglia pleasure of sex and love, which is what they were trying to fill. If the D2 receptors, here's my contention, I think this is what the science is showing us. You can't, drug addicts are kind of like stroke victims, certain areas are not working. There's the connections are not being made. So drug addicts are finding workarounds. We are taking a shortcut to our reward centers, bypassing the prefrontal cortex, because all of the dopamine or the serotonin or the oxytocin, whichever of your receptors is not working, dopamine's the one that they're doing the earliest studies on, although people have been using SSRIs for a while, so we know that there's a serotonin uptake problem, right? The receptors are not working properly. The pathways are when you have a muscle that isn't getting worked, then it becomes atrophy. Thank you. The pathways have become atrophied, and so the addict will find other ways to stimulate the reward center, other ways to get to the amygdala, and it's fast and it works, and cocaine works great, falling in love works great. And as I continue to take that same shortcut and take that same shortcut, just like teaching a stroke victim to talk again, I'm making it stronger and stronger and stronger. Only in this case, I'm making a very negative pathway stronger and stronger. And cutting new pathways, getting out of that shortcut, is the challenge of recovery. So does that make sense? Yeah. Lack of D2 receptors leads to cutting new neural pathways to stimulate the reward center because it's not getting properly stimulated normally. And it just gets worse and worse all the time, because the more I try to overstimulate my D2 receptors, the less efficient they get. And they've done studies that it shows it happens with food, it happens with behavioral addiction like overuse of the internet, and in my experience it certainly happens with sex and love. So I say that because this is a multi-pronged disease, what the 12-step programs would refer to as an allergy of the mind, bad D2 receptors, an allergy of the body or brain, the D2 receptors, an obsession of the mind, lack of the bad levels are causing the hyperfocus, the love of the romantic obsession. Stalking oftentimes is a really bad obsessive behavior. And then the behaviors that's created lead to that malady of the spirit. So it needs to be treated on all levels, the pharmaceutical, the therapeutic, and the cognitive. I know that Alexis, when I listen to her talk, she's dealing very heavily with the emotional aspect. She talks a lot about childhood trauma. She talks a lot about modeling of the parents, and I think that's absolutely a piece of the puzzle. But I think if we ignore the physiological aspect of sex and love addiction, we're not really going to get very much in the way of relief.
You can even re-trigger it too, if you ignore the brain part and just focus on
Oh, of course.
emotional.
And then you end up playing your game of whack-a-mole too, because you just find yourself something else to get addicted to. If you haven't, you can't. We have a system that tries to interdict the substance. We're treating the substance in substance abuse instead of treating the abuser. But I think this is a room full of people who understand that that's not the only way to go. So you're pretty much familiar with spotting a sex and love addict or self-test, right? I have legitimate questions on it, and then I also have my own personal, later ways to spot a love addict. Have you ever changed your route home to pass your love object's house? Extra points for parking outside and waiting. Do you leave a second or third or fourth voicemail message before the first message is returned, just in case he didn't hear it properly, or he's shy and needs encouragement, or maybe you dialed wrong, or maybe you forgot to leave a callback number, or maybe he called and you missed it, or you check his Facebook page before you check your own Facebook page in the morning. It's possible to spot the love addict. It's not that hard. The only people who can't spot it usually are the love addicts themselves. I have found incredibly active love addiction in otherwise enormously high functioning individuals. Love addiction is, as far as I'm concerned, why smart women make foolish choices. It is why perfectly nice men end up supporting strippers and their boyfriends in an apartment. Silver Lake. No, that was not personal experience. I've had worse. I had one boyfriend call me up in the middle of the night to ask me to come down and pay the hooker in the Coke motel because they were threatening to beat him up because he didn't have the money to pay the hooker in the Coke motel. And luckily I had been in recovery for a while by that time, so I hung up the phone. And then the hooker called back to ask me again. It's just like, so that's the thing. It's like a blind spot. And this from a woman who was, at that time, I think I was in the world who's who of women, right? I had a summa cum laude degree from a prestigious university. I had won author awards. And this is who I'm dating. So there's a big blind spot. And I think that part of that is the actual physiological component. But here's the tricky point. Even though it's a hugely physiological disease, and that includes gambling, spending, shoplifting, and other producers of this endogenous high, even though it is a physiological disease, a purely physiological remedy is not going to address the other aspects of it. It's not going to address the damage that the behavior causes to self-esteem, to family relationships, to career and finances, and it's not going to address the emotional toll of the disease. You can increase the available serotonin and alleviate hyperfocus with an SSRI, but that's not going to do very much to alleviate the shame spiral. So it's a medical issue that should not be treated medically. That's my contention. I have an example of an internet porn addict who went to the Mayo Clinic and asked them for help to ease his addiction to internet porn. They put him on naltrexone, which, as you know, is an opiate blocker, and it in fact did help him control his porn use, only because he no longer got any satisfaction out of looking at porn or masturbating. He will eventually find something else to make him feel good. They're working on a vaccine, the TACD, to denature cocaine. And the addict brain, as far as I'm concerned, is simply going to find another pathway. Oh, cocaine doesn't work for me anymore? I'll try meth. You know, you cannot treat substance abuse by treating the substance. You treat the abuser. And it's especially tricky when there's no substance to interdict. What are you going to do? Make, you know, the 6'2" men illegal? Are you going to, you know, I just happen to like them about that size. You know, they actually, prostitution is actually illegal. And we can see how much good that's done as far as interdicting sex addiction. So luckily, since we're talking about brain disease, and particularly a brain pathway disease, brains are very plastic. Now, the addict has been detouring around the prefrontal cortex all this time, digging that neural cow path. Our goal in recovery is to find a new pathway, to dig a new pathway. And we need to teach the brain to develop new muscles, again, the same way that you teach a stroke victim to, you know, use their left hand again or recover their ability to speak English. Where's my cat? There we go. Neuroplasticity in a nutshell. Doctor, it hurts when I do that. So I don't do that.
Then don't do it. Yeah.
So don't do that. So yeah, that should be later. So dopamine, as we saw in earlier slides, and you have copies of the slides, and oxytocin and serotonin and vasopressin are actually produced in several areas of the brain, in the substantia nigra, in the ventral tegmental area. That means nothing to me. But we saw in the brain scans, we saw actual pictures of how redundant those systems are. That the dopamine lights up here, 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 and here, and the serotonin lights up here, 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 and here. And even then, as I said, we've only addressed a fraction of the available neurotransmitters, many of which may be redundant. So we have to address rewiring our brains. Now, if there's no substance to remove, I mean, we know how to rewire an alcoholic or a drug addict brain. You establish abstinence, you stop drinking, you stop using, you stop smoking cigarettes. It's a little harder when there's no substance to be abstinent from. So, what I have found in my personal experience and in my studies is that you can change behaviors and that'll start rewiring stuff. We're trying to rebalance our dopamine, our oxytocin, and our serotonin, essentially. And they do come back. There's a book called The Compass of Pleasure by David Linden. It deals mostly with substance addiction, but it finds that D2 receptors will bounce back after a cocaine stimulation is withdrawn in as little as 2 days. However, when there's a natural pleasure enhancer, like cheesecake, it takes a minimum of 40 days or longer. So, physically, there is evidence and mounting evidence that endogenous or process addiction is actually more powerful, chemically more powerful than substance addiction. So we really should not take it lightly, although people do, hence my joke about the woman with 2 black eyes. Love addiction can kill you. Mm-hmm. Love addiction can kill you because you get AIDS because you just don't have it in you to ask them to wear a condom. Love addiction can kill you from domestic violence when you're staying in a bad relationship, or spousal murder if you're trying to leave one. Love addiction kills people from suicide all the time. Now, back in 1991, they did a study of the romantically dumped, as they inelegantly put it, and said that 40% experienced clinically measured depression. I disagree with that. I think that the odds are that many of these people were not clinically depressed. I think love sickness, which is what the romantically dumped are experiencing, is a lot closer to a nicotine fit than it is to clinical depression. I think that it is a reaction to the recession of brain neurotransmitters that the person has become dependent on. We're taking away their drug, taking away the person that's causing those balances of the oxytocin, the serotonin, and the dopamine to give them at least some level of peace. And there are studies now that a controlled plasma study found that stalkers have serotonin levels similar to people with OCD. So they're trying to supplement, a brain chemical that's gone down since their lover left. They're hyperfocusing, and so here are some things that can be suggested to a client to help, as I say, put the plug in the jug. Erase his voicemails, delete his texts, archive his emails. Do not drive by his house, drop in his office, or join his gym. I know someone who did that. And she was otherwise a beautiful woman who had a 12-year obsession with this unavailable guy. Oh, she's in the book, by the way. And that was the last time I saw her before the book came out. She had just joined someone's gym to be able to discuss it. If he sees me enough, he'll just know. Box and store. I don't say burn or tear up or get rid of, but archive, box, store, get out of your physical sight, triggering things such as gifs and photos and love letters. Do not cyber stalk him on Facebook. Facebook is death for love addicts. Death for love addicts. Getting into that rat hole of who's that girl in the picture and what's her story and who are her friends and what did so-and-so say about so-and-so. If you date me, guys out there in podcast land, if you date me, I will unfriend you. I will block you. That's it. It's nothing personal. Well, I mean, it is personal, but it's just I do not want to be anywhere near that rat hole. When I work with women, I give them, you can't not be on the internet, but you can give yourself a time limit. You can put a timer on it. There are ways to get yourself, invisible on Facebook. But I absolutely recommend block him. Whoever he is, she is, block them. Call a friend before calling that person. People put stickers on their phones that say, dial this number for pain. They change it. Well, you should totally take them out of all of your electronics. Just gone. Just not available to text message, not available to phone. They can't phone you. They can't text message you. Do not call and pretending to be someone else. I've seen women do that a lot. And then in a more general sense, because in my experience, you need to kind of like have a palate cleanser. You need to bring down the temperature on all of this. So because it's so easy to transfer addictions, it's just like, I'm not obsessively stalking that guy anymore. You look good. Let's go in the back seat of my car. People are still trying to keep the addiction going, keep the substances, the endogenous high going. So it's good to address some of the other areas, even though it doesn't seem to be my problem. It's just like, masturbation isn't my problem. Okay, don't do it for 30 days and see how you feel. And so this is another list, and you have this slide printed. I do not demand that someone abstain from sex outside of a committed relationship, but some people feel that that's important. This is an abstinence that is self-determined, but it's really important to have an outside voice, like a counselor or therapist, help a person decide on their bottom lines, because when self-determined, it's really easy to give up the behaviors that obviously hurt and keep the ones that have still have a little bit of thrill in them. It's just, first I got rid of the gross motor defects, then I started looking at the interstitial stuff. It's like, okay, I won't go out with any married men. Okay, or men in a relationship. I won't date any guys that are more than 20 years younger than me. Okay, 10. So, water break. Well, actually, we're doing great. We're doing fantastic. I talk fast. It's easy. I'm going to talk a little about the newest research and what we're looking at in the future, but if you want to take a break and talk about intervention modalities or anything else that you had thoughts on, take a break. Yeah.
What do you think about sort of atypical stuff to be able to like increase the pathways in the prefrontal cortex, such as learning a musical instrument, doing something like that actually, or meditation, mindfulness?
Meditation, great for serotonin. I can actually feel the serotonin swell up in my brain when I meditate. Dopamine, yes, learning something new or doing something risky, great for dopamine. So yes, those are wonderful methods. I had someone came to me saying, I'm so about to have an affair. I'm so about to cheat on my husband, and I said, go skydiving.
But on that account, isn't that still reinforcing it, and that's burning out the receptors?
Yes, and now we're
yeah.
in the area of harm reduction, and that is a it's controversial, and I think each of you get to decide how much you want to lean towards harm reduction and how much you want to lean towards immediate abstinence. Because the same thing, learning to play an instrument, you could consider that. Oh well, that's still activating your dopamine system. So generally, I always say that if you have a response to something that's that little thrill of ooh, I won't tell anyone that. That's a bad idea. Yes.
You haven't mentioned norepinephrine, and I think of that as being involved in this.
Absolutely norepinephrine, absolutely beta-phenylphthalein, PEA.
Right.
Yeah. That one. Yes, there are, I just went with the three sort of like most obviously discrete responses because I wanted to keep it to that love less than limerence. But yes, norepinephrine very involved in both attraction and affection, vasopressin in men, PEA. PEA is what gives you that sweaty palms and the increased heartbeat and the physical signs of new infatuation. So yeah, there's a lot of adrenaline is heavily involved.
So
testosterone.
Would you say norepinephrine is more involved with the infatuation fantasy addict, or is it specifically involved with one of these three? More like, is it not so much involved with the sexaholic and more involved with the?
It's not. Well, it's a little involved with all of them.
Okay.
Which is, I think, why I eliminated it.
Yeah.
It's
okay.
a little involved with all of them.
Okay.
In your research, have you found any difference if it wanes, like the testosterone and hormones with women losing the estrogen in menopausal? Does anything change? I know men have Viagra and all of that, but does that make a difference?
Yeah, Viagra is basically just a physiological thing. It isn't going to increase the desire so much. And yes, definitely losing estrogen and losing testosterone will decrease the desire. But if you're working on a dopamine issue, you might still be pursuing that even though it isn't going to give you the same satisfaction. Just like the poor rat that's eating without getting any satisfaction out of it.
So you're going to substitute it with gambling or something, other addiction?
Yeah, easily. Or might still be pursuing the same behaviors because of the old adage that, it's insanity is doing the same thing expecting a different result. My 83-year-old mother, when she died, I had to go and unjoin Match.com and OkCupid and JDate and at 83 and after 5 marriages, she still was pursuing that same unavailable satisfaction because it was the pursuit. It wasn't, I don't think she was very sexual at 83, I could be wrong, but I don't think she was very sexual at 83. But it was the pursuit.
Mentally, it was just something she was...
Right. So it's my personal experience as a postmenopausal woman is I have had a certain amount of relief. Now that may just be length of recovery, length of abstinence, or it may be a gift of decreased estrogen levels. And studies are yet to be done, and
So
it would be great to do
on
more.
this oxytocin.
Oxytocin?
I've heard a lot about that.
The cuddle chemical, I call it.
The cuddle chemical.
Yes.
Meaning,
It's a bonding chemical. You actually do get an increased oxytocin response in your brain if you hug someone. If you hug for more than 20 seconds, there's another behavior modification for you. Tell people to go out and hug someone for more than 20 seconds.
I know some men want to say, hey, let's just get together, no sex, just cuddle.
And that's increases oxytocin. So that's somewhat, yeah. Well, it will increase it for you too, but your brain may not be an oxytocin-seeking brain.
I actually heard a male sperm can increase oxytocin in females. Ingesting it orally, anally, vaginally.
That makes sense. Yeah. I mean, they do know that orgasm enormously increases oxytocin, but that the physiological part of it, that makes sense. Yeah. How does it do it? Well, there's one way. Yes, in the back.
My question is more towards assessment of a love addict.
Mhm.
I mean, a lot of young adults, especially women, you know, you break up and you do a lot of these things that you mentioned. So how do you know if it's love addiction versus desperation for marriage, let's say, or a relationship or whatever, something else?
That is the gray area, and that's where professionals come in. I often say that behaviors and heightened emotion, intensity of emotion that's absolutely appropriate at 17 is a little embarrassing at 38. So to a certain extent, all addiction, there's an AA joke that says AA stands for arrested adolescence. To a certain amount, all of addiction has to do with the juvenile brain, the executive function, the prefrontal cortex. Boy, I wish that wasn't such a tongue twister. Has not properly developed its pathways, partially for genetic reasons, partially for behavioral reasons, right? So when I got clean and sober at the age of 35, and I was still waiting for someone to call and invite me to the junior prom. My romantic brain was still functioning on the level of the 16-year-old because I had never worked those muscles. I had always done a shortcut to my reward centers, and so my behavioral patterns were exactly the same as they had been when I was 16 and 17. This led to a fairly ungraceful life in my 30s and 40s. So yeah, what you can look at all of the list of, you can look at the 20 questions for love addiction, and a 16-year-old can probably answer all of them. Do you spend all day thinking about the person? Do you obsess on the person? Do you talk, do you talk and text a dozen times a day? It's like, yes, yes, yes. You're 40 and you're still doing the same thing, you're looking at someone who very likely has an issue.
So longevity of the behavior.
Well, it's the inappropriateness of the behavior for the person's life at the time. And in a way, we can go back to the definition of addiction. It is, it's a chronic and relapsing brain disease characterized by obsessive pursuit of a mind-altering substance, despite negative life consequences. So that's where the negative life consequences comes in the actual official definition. Because you can be texting your 16-year-old boyfriend 20 times a day when you're 16. That's not going to have negative life consequences. Do it when you're 50 and have a family to support. It can have negative life consequences. Yeah.
I was just thinking too that, when people do fall in love with all the lust and all of the chemistry going on in falling in love, it's very similar to love addiction and sex addiction in the brain.
No, it's exactly the same.
Right, so you stay there, and I think it's interesting because you can see even when people are in love and being dumped, they go into actual withdrawal.
Yes.
Right? So it seems it's similar to like an alcoholic that for some reason can't drink like a normal person.
Right.
Is that a love addict can't really fall in love normally without getting hooked in.
And like alcoholism, it affects approximately 6 to 8% of the population. Plenty of people can fall in love and have all of those get high, just like plenty of people can drink pink champagne and get buzzed off their ass, and then the next week everything is fine. And some people drink pink champagne and get buzzed off their ass and end up in a jail cell in Iowa. Some people can fall in love, and it goes through the various stages of developing into a deepening romance, and other people go like, okay, that was fun, now can I do it again? So that's, yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question to this? Because when you work with sex and love addicts, right, and that what you're talking about, the unattainable object, attachment theory also obviously comes into that, right? And that for some, like I work with for example, love addicts that have sexual abuse in their history, where that's actually the safest place for them because they can feel the love without being intruded on.
Yep. And then you've got the whole enmeshment versus avoidant.
Right.
These are all pieces of the puzzle. I don't want to invalidate any of that. I just want to say that don't ignore brain chemistry as being a piece of the puzzle. I mean, I have attachment disorder because of my mother was borderline personality. I also have a sister who's not a drug addict, a sex addict, or a love addict. You know, brought up by the same mother. So there were differences from the gate. And in my research and my opinion and my experience, those are genetic, they are biological, and they can't be ignored. You can't say, I'll fix your mommy issues and you won't be an addict anymore. No, you'll be an addict without mommy issues.
Right.
So and the point of where we're going, this is actually a good, segue, because what we're finding now is the latest behavioral research is that it's complicated. Okay, first there's the study of epigenetics, which is the next layer on top of genetics, which is really promising for people who are in recovery because it shows that we can, by our behavior, change not only our neural pathways, but change our gene expression. We have like on-off switches on a lot of our genes, and by changing our gene expression, the new gene expression can be inherited. There's another layer, that the genetics is not destiny. That epigenetics suggests that we can permanently change our gene expression. But it also indicates that we can mess up our entire genetic blueprint by our behavior. There's a protein that's recently been found in study called delta FOSB. I'm gonna put delta FOSB. Delta FOSB. So delta FOSB is a protein that builds up in the reward pathways after exposure to cocaine or meth, and it sticks around for at least 4 to 6 weeks after the last exposure to cocaine or meth, and it stays sensitive to substances. The brain becomes permanently sensitized. I mean, it can take a long time to build up the delta FOSB, and it can go dormant as soon as you take away the substance. But then the minute you introduce, it's like they say that you always pick up drinking exactly where you left off. That's because of the current thinking is the delta FOSB. It's a researcher says it's like a molecular switch. Once it's flipped on, it stays on. It doesn't go away easily. Now, delta FOSB can actually be used as a marker for a level of addiction or craving, although I don't know that there's currently any testing done for it. There will be, I'm sure. You could perhaps learn to engineer it away and therefore really decrease the physiological aspect of addiction with genetic engineering, but we're not there yet. Oh, by the way, gambling also produces delta FOSB. And I'm sure that falling in love does, and I'm sure that repeated viewing of porn does too. So this is something that is resident in the brain. Once we have manufactured it, we can't just eliminate it. And that's why I say, an addict who's, fixed for mommy issues has still got delta FOSB from the abuse, whether exogenous or endogenous.
I'm sorry, what did you say delta FOSB is?
Delta FOSB is a protein that builds up in the reward pathways, or builds up in the, I guess it's the ventral tegmental area, don't hold me to that. It builds up after repeated exposure to cocaine, meth and gambling are the studies that they've done so far. So it builds up, and and it sticks around for 4 to 6 weeks after the last exposure, and it stays dormant, as far as they know now, for life, ready to be reactivated by any new exposure to the cocaine or the meth or the gambling.
So you're saying if it lays dormant for all these years and then somebody picks up something, a cocaine or gambling,
It's
whatever,
been sensitized, yes.
to the same level?
Yeah,
What
that's
is that the language that says that the addiction is doing push-ups?
right. Yeah, that would be the That would be the physiological basis for that.
And when it's activated, what does that add to the experience when it's already present versus someone who doesn't have it in their system?
All it does is it shows a propensity for addiction and the increasing physiological changes that addiction cause. This is really new stuff, and we can all Google together and see if there's anything new done on it. I was looking at a study by an Eric Nestler, and I didn't even write down where he did the study. But the theory is that brains become permanently sensitized by the production of delta phosphate, which is not a neurotransmitter. It exists in the white matter. It's a protein, and that once built up, it can go dormant, but it can never go away.
Because I was wondering if that's tied into the fact, like, I worked with a lot of meth users, and it was pretty much understood that once you started having psychotic symptoms, the consequence of your meth use, like, it got to that point, even if you dropped it for years, when you used it again, you'd instantly get psychotic symptoms.
That is very likely one of the pathways to that, but this is really new and preliminary research. So at the moment, that's what they're calling the thing that makes that happen. So that's how I'm supposed to look when my face isn't swollen. I don't have to. So when I started writing Love Addict, one of the psychiatrists I interviewed said that if he got up in front of the American Psychiatric Association and talked about love addiction, he'd be laughed out of the room. He said, if only I could set up some controlled studies, if only I could get some data. 2 years later, a colleague of his actually stood up in front of the American Psychiatric Association, talked about love addiction, and he had studies and he had data, and maybe a few people chuckled, but every new piece of evidence confirms what we suspected from the beginning, which is that you can get addicted to love. It is characterized by the phenomenon of craving and withdrawal, and we've all seen it, if not experienced it. And it should be addressed with the same treatment options that we would use for any other addiction. That's my premise. Yes?
So, when you say love, addicted to love, all the examples, I think most all the examples you used weren't what some of us might call love.
Well, there's the three different kinds. There's the infatuation, which is the more dopamine connected. There is the codependent relationship, love, which is more oxytocin dependent. And then there's the pursuit of sexuality, which is the more
that Helen Fisher would call the real love, the bonding.
Would be
love?
Yeah, it would be well, what it would be is, I forget what brain hormone I'm trying to work with. What Helen Fisher or what many other just sort of observers would say is what you're supposed to have in a healthy human being is a progression. That is, you pursue someone out of lust, you have affection for them out of romantic love, and then you bond with them out of the desire to create a family unit or to be, in a partnership.
So are you saying you can become addicted to that third one?
You can become addicted to any of them.
The family unit, the
Yes.
healthy kind of love.
No, you don't become, if it's healthy, by definition, if it's healthy, it's not addictive.
Well, that's what I'm concerned.
So
That's why the word love confuses me.
It's very confusing, and books and books and books and poems and songs and everything else have been written about love.
So it's really
healthy
lust
love,
and romance.
yeah.
love.
Healthy, but no, you can also be addicted to relationships. That's the joke about the woman with two black eyes. It's the idea of leaving the bonded relationship is so incredibly scary. It's so just the mere thought of being without this other person in your life is so anxiety producing that you'll put up with any amount of physical abuse.
Yeah, I understand. I'm just trying to clarify
okay.
the word love because it sounds
no,
like
the word love is very
encompasses the healthy kind of love.
Absolutely
What you mean
it does,
is the lust and the romantic love part.
Well, no, like I said, you can become addicted, you can become stuck in any one of the three tracks.
Even the healthy kind.
No, that's not healthy if you're stuck.
So then you
Not
can't get
healthy
stuck
if
in the
you're
healthy
stuck.
kind of love.
Right, not.
So then the word love, it's just
Yeah,
a
some
logistical
of this is
healthy.
simply semantic,
Yeah.
and we don't necessarily have a rich enough vocabulary in the English language. They might in French to discuss it. But if you're in a healthy long-term relationship that has boundaries, that has communication, that has all the stuff you're looking for, it is by definition not addictive. If you're staying in a relationship that is, negative life consequences, if you're staying in a relationship that's causing you financial harm, physical harm, emotional harm, then that's by definition addictive. Yeah.
Is part of it, like just maybe making a differentiation between the three things, like all of these stages are healthy.
Can be.
Can be healthy.
Yes.
It's that if you're stuck in one place, so it's not that the only good or healthy kind of love is the relationship.
Absolutely.
Lust is completely healthy.
Absolutely.
If it's a problem, it's not healthy.
Right.
So it's not saying that only one of these is a healthy thing.
Absolutely. The addict will generally have a preference for one or the other, and that's perfectly able to flip-flop. I always say when you get tired enough of clutching someone's ankle as they're desperately trying to leave the room, you'll get up, dust yourself off, and go pick up the nearest person who might clutch your ankle as you're leaving the room. So it flip-flops a lot. Yeah.
It's interesting when you, nowadays when you're meeting people, the man is very visual and he just probably wants boobs or face, or he looks at the shell.
That's how men process, yeah.
He just looks at the shell, and the woman falls for him because she's looking for making a baby. So it's always interesting how
I don't want to make a baby.
these three stages, they may hit and miss each other and they don't see it.
The thing that I always try to, when people are having problems, one is really worrisome. Most people want to get into recovery from love addiction so that they can get healthy enough to have a relationship. That is a really bad premise to start with. One of the basic metaphysical problems with love addiction is that one is looking for someone outside themselves for salvation. They're looking to be fixed. Just like a junkie is looking to be fixed, the love addict is looking to be fixed. And so they're looking to someone outside themselves to make them whole, to make them complete, to affirm them, and to make them okay. So that is one of the basic metaphysical problems. Like I said, three-pronged. It's biological, it's emotional, it's behavioral, and it's metaphysical. So it really doesn't have anything to do with dating or men or women. Or yes, there's a lot of cultural reinforcement for bad ideas about sex, love, and dating, but that isn't the addiction problem. And I think it's important to separate that. There's been every bit as much bad information about love and dating in the world for my friends who have healthy relationships as there has been for me who has terrible relationships. I can't blame it on, the songs. So
They can try.
much as I would like to. A man without love is but half of a man, and a woman is nothing at all.
Let it go.
So, the difficulties of dating don't have that much to do with love addiction. And when someone in withdrawal comes crying to me about he did and he said and what if and he and I realize nothing to do with him. That's just the latest face on your the object of desire. It isn't him, it's how he makes you feel. It's how he makes you feel. You're not reaching for him, you're not addicted to him. You're addicted to the feeling of being in pursuit of someone, of being connected to someone, or being physical with someone. Those are the three main tracks. And so it has nothing to do with him.
No, I have clients who are obsessive on the internet. They're on it. They go out for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day or every night. And
Negative life
and they
consequences.
have that Cinderella complex that he's my prince, and then it phases off, and they come back again. They go again on the internet. It's a cycle, won't stop, and it's interesting how you try to help them.
Right, and as I'm trying to represent that, yes, a certain amount of that is growing up with that Cinderella complex, but a certain amount of that is that this person is addicted to the constant pump of anticipation, which is the dopaminergic response. They are addicted to the feeling of anticipation that this is going to be the guy. It's not just the belief system that the guy is out there. It's the actual physical addiction to the response of, ooh, this could be the one.
Right. They always say that, oh, this could be the one.
This could be the one. That's a symptom of dopamine deficiency in the brain. So it's just like it's another modality to look at. You can explain to someone all day and all night that, well, you're just going to get disappointed because you're projecting and you're hanging ornaments on a bare Christmas tree, and in 6 months you're going to find out that he's not the person that you imagine him to be, and he's going to find out that you're not the person he imagined you to be, and blah, blah, blah. Or you can just say, okay, this person is totally pumping dopamine, and we have to find a way to intercede. It just gives you, it's another tool in your toolbox.
Alright. I also find, because I work with full-blown addicts, sex and love addicts, but I also work with, like, let's say, singular infidelity moments, where, you know, they over time are not showing that they have addictive tendencies, but they're in crisis
And sometimes
for
they
that. And you can
don't,
apply
yeah.
some of the same concepts and explanations for both in the same way.
Yeah.
It's just, I find it really helpful, even though I'm not treating a love addict per se, it's very applicable to those types of crises as well.
Yeah, because it can stop a spiral, and also, as I always say, one of the reasons that you get better with help is that we're not usually all crazy at the same time. We're generally all crazy, but we're not usually all crazy at the same time. And when I am in one of those spirals, I really need someone totally on the outside to go like, Ethlie, you realize you're nuts now, right? You realize it's totally nuts. And even if I don't believe it, my executive function, my prefrontal cortex, knows it to be true. So that's what you guys are here for. And I'm so glad that you are. And I saw Douglas poke his nose in, so I think he's trying to tell us to wrap up. So I have like books that you can buy if you want, and I'll sign it for you. And there's I've got the blog, and I love to get questions to the blog. I love to do like advice to the really lovelorn stuff. And so I really appreciate interaction. And I'm so happy that you were all here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.